This is a film about the American writer and his city, the city that poets and novelists and social prophets have taught us to confront, to accept, even to rejoice in as the human community made real. Oneself I sing, a simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. Of life immense in passion, pulse, and power, cheerful, for freest action formed, under the laws divine, the modern man I sing. I am Alfred Kazin, and this particular piece of New York City, this esplanade, this harbor, this skyline, the sound of what is still the most dramatic harbor in the world, is my favorite perch on the great city. This is the place I start from and come back to for a more loving view of the city in space and light. This is the flood tide along which Whitman, crossing Brooklyn Ferry a century ago, said he could see us face to face. And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west and the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands large and small. 50 years hence, others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them. A few years ago, an exhibition largely of photographs opened at the Jewish Museum in New York. Portal to America, the Lower East Side, 1870 to 1925. Outside and in, the museum made you think of success and of the good taste that must go these days with success. But the photographs were of immigrants, their ancestors. I saw great crowds of prosperous, well-dressed, extremely sophisticated-looking people, the usual museum crowd, standing in front of enormously blown-up pictures of their parents and grandparents waiting on Ellis Island benches, or standing behind pushcarts on Hester Street while children got some relief at open hydrants from August in New York. The most extraordinary photograph was by Jacob Riis, who showed us how the other half lives. A bearded Jew is preparing for Sabbath Eve in a coal cellar on Ludlow Street. It is 1900, he lives in a coal cellar, but there's a Sabbath loaf on the grimy table in front of him. He will not die in a Polish ditch for the greater glory of the master race. And in the 1960s, his grandchildren will walk out of that museum down Fifth Avenue, not even having to say to themselves that the city has been their savior, that it was once a frontier exciting in anticipation and fact. They have come to these photographs looking for their ancestors, their old selves, their hidden selves. The city is no longer their frontier, and usually they are afraid of it as well as ashamed of it. The city that saved them and raised them has by now worn out their expectations of it. As they say, it is impossible to live in New York. That is the first and last thing New Yorkers now say about New York. It is impossible. Like the technological society, the big city has overreached itself. The pressures. There is so much humanity packed into these streets, so much busyness, so much friction, so much hatred, that we are haunted by the screams we hear in the night, the screams against which we close our windows, our ears, our minds. Too much, we say. It is all too much. Why should we have to confront such numbers and all the injustice of our time just because we live in a big city? But it was ever so, for there's always been a writer to see it so. The writer for whom imagination and his natural concern with the quality of life become one. Think of those 19th century writers from small towns, from old-fashioned America, coming on the big city for the first time. It is the end of the century, a gathering of the forces that have helped us to make us what we are now, as we rush to the end of our century. In the 1890s, the writers most sensitive to the city were indeed strangers to it, found it as strange as European peasants landing on Ellis Island did. Here is William Dean Howells on the Lower East Side in 1895. It was squalor of a kind which, it seemed to me, it could not be possible to outrival anywhere in the life one commonly calls civilized. It is true that the Indians who formerly inhabited this island were no more comfortably lodged in their wigwams of bark and skins than these poor New Yorkers in their tenements. But the wild men pay no rent and have the freedom of the forest and the prairie about them. They have the illimitable sky and the whole light of day and the four winds to breathe when they issue into the open air. The New York tenement dwellers, even when they leave their lairs, are still pent in their high-walled streets and inhale 1,000 stenches of their own and others' making. But in the 19th century, there were also famous American writers who were native New Yorkers. Herman Melville, Henry James, Edith Wharton. They too were essentially hostile to the masses crowding New York, for their views were essentially, as we say, aristocratic old New York. Have you ever seen those modest old town houses in the East 20s where Herman Melville lived? Or look at those beautiful examples of the Greek revival still standing in Washington Square. That's where Henry James's novel, Washington Square, took place. In his account of a native's return, The American Scene, Henry James wrote that on the East Side, one stared at this all-unconscious impudence of the agency of future ravage. He said about the New York streets, the consummate, monotonous commonness of the pushing male crowd moving in its dense mass, confusion carried to chaos for any intelligence, any perception, a welter of objects and sounds in which relief, detachment, dignity, meaning perished utterly and lost all rights. He complained that face after face unmistakably was low. James still believed in the old American way that cities in America were not as significant as a few great men could be. This is what all the older American writers believed. In the South, where there were no great cities anyway, in the North, where transcendentalists and other pure spirits believed that cities, even the size of Boston, were artificial and morally damaging. This was the old American faith. Power is in the individual, not in numbers, in spirit, not in material conglomeration. Culture, as Jefferson might have said, produces power, not power, culture. Before the end of the 19th century, the best American minds did not identify significant achievement with American cities. But there was already one exception in the 19th century who was to be prophetic. Prophetic of the importance of New York as a world capital of many races and peoples. Prophetic of the importance of poetry in shaping 20th century epics of the city. Uniquely gifted among American writers of his time and place, Walt Whitman found himself as man and artist by identifying with New York. None of the talented writers born and bred in New York was to make of it such an instrument of personal liberation, such a living, glowing fable of democratic possibility. Walt Whitman, poet, formerly a schoolteacher, formerly a printer, formerly a newspaper man, formerly a carpenter, a failure at many occupations, born into a family of failures and psychic cripples, he felt that he had come out of the anonymous city crowd with its unheard griefs and hopes to speak for the union of genius with democracy. One self I sing, a simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. Whitman, it can be said, found the motto and form of his book, the one book he kept writing all his life, in the city. Its volume and mass, its mobility, excitement, danger. Years ago, I lived just across from the corner in Brooklyn Heights where Whitman himself first printed Leaves of Grass. Every Sunday, by way of Brooklyn Bridge, I walked over the East River that was, for him, the most significant waterway in the world. I realized how much Whitman's long single lines, each a complete journey in itself, was formed on his ferry journeys back and forth across that estuary. Whitman's instinct in composition was to enter into free association with himself. Every thought, every image might be a link to something else. This is a modern city aesthetic born of the extraordinary number of stimuli, of the constant, irritable, exciting proximity of so many people and spectacles in the modern city. Joyce was to use this principle in Ulysses. City full, passing away, other cityful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavements, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands, this owner, that. Landlord never dies, they say. Other steps into his shoes when he gets his notice to quit. They buy the place up with gold, and still they have all the gold. Eliot's words in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Hart Crane in the bridge. Insistently through sleep, a tide of voices, they meet you listening midway in your dream. The long, tired sounds, fog-insulated noises, gongs in white surplices, beshrouded wails, far strum of foghorns, signals dispersed in veils. As with Lorca in The Poet in New York, with Dos Passos in Manhattan Transfer, the modern city has inspired new literary forms as well as the hardest social thinking. These have often been the forms of poetic thinking, of inclusion and celebration, of unity between man and the city world he has created. Many prophets of the city have shown that we are held in the city by our need of a collective life, by our need of belonging and sharing. Whitman's New York is a city of joys and possibilities, of easy afternoons riding next to the drivers of the great omnibuses tearing down Broadway, of ecstatic walks on empty ocean beaches at Coney Island. Above all, it is a city rich in sexual excitement, a city for lovers. The loneliness that wells up from so many silent faces in the city expresses also anticipation that only the great city creates. Happenings, chance meetings, sudden embraces, lovers' quarrels in the night, disturbances. Everybody is here, and sometimes anything seems possible. In the great city, people rush toward each other as if there were nothing here but other people, and the image of other people we carry in ourselves. Cities, as people still have to be told, are among the greatest inventions of social man. Cities are creative deeds and centers of creativity. Consciousness of the poet with the energy of the crowd at the rush hour, and with his love of us, the strangers yet to come here in the future. He said, Closer yet I approach you. What thought you have of me now, I had as much of you. I laid in my stores in advance. I considered long and seriously of you before you were born. Who was to know what should come home to me? Who knows but I am enjoying this? Who knows for all the distance, but I am as good as looking at you now, for all you cannot see me? Imaginatively speaking, the city came into its own when the masses, the new men, produced their own writers. These writers found their sense of power in the new great modern American cities: Chicago, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Harlem. The fable behind all these famous 20th century novels, Maggie, Sister Carrie, McTeague, An American Tragedy, USA, Studs Lonergan, is the price of ambition, the dream of success, the taste of defeat. These novels are always about winners and losers. The sudden vision of success that the city gives provincials, rustics, outsiders who come to it from afar is a vision that the city can often destroy, but not before it has summoned up, perhaps uniquely in modern industrial civilization, the romantic vision. So whatever the cost they pay for the city's heartlessness, anonymity, coldness, the key figures in our urban novels, Carrie Meba, Hurstwood, Jay Gatsby, Nick Carraway, Danny O'Neill, Miss Lonely Hearts, Augie March, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, have been given moral stature by the hopes aroused in them by the city. They find tragic stature by their defeat as living, struggling, hoping men. American writers beginning in the 20th century caught the new sense of scale involved even in moving to a big city. That is why so many of the best novels and poems were written by Midwesterners: Dreiser, Anderson, Cather, Lindsay, Fitzgerald, Lewis, Hemingway. It was only the dream of the big city by those relatively new to it, and all America was still new to it at the birth of the 20th century, that would create the solid, original imagery for so many unexpected experiences. This is where American writing came of age into the real world of men. Auden speaks in a poem of Eros, builder of cities. Without the city, we should have had no literature of man and woman. Dreiser's Sister Carrie starts out timidly for Chicago. On the train, she finds a protector who will lead her to still another. In Stephen Crane's Maggie, we see from the first the connection the city makes between poverty and sexuality. Stephen Crane never put the flesh into his books as graphically as he did The Color of War, but he suggested the particular atmosphere of expectancy and promiscuity, the peculiar loneliness inherent in city living. Frank Norris, in his best novel, McTeague, melodramatized the connection that San Francisco made to his mind between greed for money and sexuality, in a marvelous compound of streets, clothes, smells, sounds, temptations, hurry, vertigo, strangeness. No one else has yet rendered this early physical experience of the city with so much feeling, brought up from the depths of our common nature, as did Theodore Dreiser. He had an eerie way of describing commonplace things as if no one had seen them before him. Each single object had been stamped on his brain. Everything was singular, hallucinatory, painfully distinct with that first impression of an utterly new world. Chicago was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871, and much of it was still being built up for the first time. Dreiser caught its rawness and bleakness as he caught the stupor and loneliness in Carrie's heart. Chicago fascinated these new writers because it had been conquered from the prairie all around them. It had been built, one writer said, exclusively for the purpose of making money. It was America halfway between the wilderness and the stock exchange. Chicago became the favorite subject of these new novelists. It was easier to get hold of than New York. It was present to the writer's eye all at once. The transformation from the old farm life to the magnificent views from Lakeshore Drive was the work of one short, violent gesture in history. Guy's images of Chicago and Sister Carrie catch the poignancy of so many American beginnings. He said, "The city had laid miles and miles of streets where perhaps one solitary house stood out alone. There were regions open to the sweeping winds and rain, which were yet lighted throughout the night with long blinking lines of gas lamps fluttering in the wind. Narrow boardwalks extended out, passing here a house and there a store, at far intervals eventually ending up on the open prairie." Those Midwesterners who were socially more privileged and had greater scope, like Scott Fitzgerald from St. Paul, naturally gravitated to New York. And to this day, Fitzgerald remains the only poet of New York's luxurious upper-class landmarks like the Plaza Hotel. New York was a dreamland to Fitzgerald. It represented his imagination of what is forever charming, touched by the glamour of money, romantically tender and gay. No writer born to New York's constant pressure can ever associate so much beauty with it, can ever think of New York as the Plaza Hotel. But Fitzgerald felt about New York what a man might feel about an adored woman too exciting to be trusted. New York was the pleasure capital, the fulfillment of all possible dreams in St. Paul. New York was much more beautiful to Fitzgerald than was Paris. He has the feeling for the textures and lights of the metropolitan glitter that the enraptured guest gets at the great New York feast. No wonder that he speaks of enchanted metropolitan twilight, of forms leaning together in taxis, of New York on summer afternoons as overripe, as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall into your hands. For him, the name of the American dream was New York. By the mid-20s, a great part of American writing was urban in feeling. Faulkner, Frost, Hemingway were perhaps still country boys at heart, but many of the interesting new writers were not. And the power centers of American life, the idols of our tribe, were Wall Street, Madison Avenue, Broadway, Michigan Boulevard, Hollywood, Detroit, Reno, Pittsburgh, Miami. The old tender provincial perspective on the big city was getting blurred by the gritty brick of the tenements. Kilroy lived here, and every Kilroy wrote an angry novel about it afterwards. Always the same forces forever beating the protagonist down into anonymity and sameness. Always the same anger, the same sentimentality, the same loveless population on the bed that Tiresias observed in Eliot's The Wasteland. Eliot in London crying unreal city in his greatest poem, warned against falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. He was the last and most influential of the American patrician writers who have seen the modern mass city as a nightmare, a spiritual atrocity. Eliot distinctly heard ancestral voices prophesying war against tradition. And in The Wasteland, he described with faultless precision and stunning emotional impact the joylessness and terror of a completely secular civilization. This has become our truth. Modern urban realism is full of mighty forces that have been described too often by too many people in the same words. The language of the modern city novel has been worn down by the pressures of bigness, the torpor of the lonely crowd, the banality of American violence. Only a handful of writers has really done justice to the mass experience in the big city. Richard Wright's Native Son, Clifford Odets' Awake and Sing, Saul Bellows' The Victim, James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Henry Roth's Call It Sleep, Bernard Malamud's The Assistant, the autobiography of Malcolm X, Norman Mailer's The Armies of the Night. In Saul Bellows' The Victim, which is really a fable of the Jew's anxiety in the moral climate created by Hitler, the protagonist's uncertainties, his human ignorance, his extraordinary passivity and fumbling come through to us as the heat, dampness, shiftiness of the awful New York summer. Bellows' fable was written from a complexity and subtlety that no other literary artist has brought to this terrifying subject. That is why the descriptions of streets, subways, the Staten Island ferry, the New York summer terrify us. They penetrate right to the soul. They make us realize what an intolerable weight of guilt we now all bear in the city, how uneasy we are with ourselves, and how easy it is to accuse us. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man begins in a cellar in Harlem and is an allegory of our American journey from country innocence to city experience. Ellison does not feel that he is nothing but a victim of race hatred. He does not feel victimized at all. He writes as an artist, not as that mythical symbol, the common man. Invisible Man is a triumph of art over humiliation, of creative wit over the ugliness and degradation that great American cities still represent for those who are being pushed out of sight. One Negro pilgrim's life journey comes alive for us not only as Negro experience, but as a burning, sulfurous fable of the sense of unreality that prolonged inhumanity finally creates. In a great modern city, everything is excessive. Human nature seems more demanding than elsewhere, more naturally unsatisfiable. Yet nothing in modern times has so excited writers as the sight and sound of this much passion, this much unity of feeling, this endless clamor in the human heart. More and more the crowds surrounding us tell of a new society pressing to be born. Only literature has done justice to the city as the heart and genius of the human community. Only our writers have shown us the city not as a problem to solve, but as an experience to share.